Hello, everyone. Settler's Lament here again. And I think I just remembered that I forgot to turn the monetization button on for this stream, so that's a problem.
What's even the point?
But yes, so that will be turning on in a few right now, hopefully. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. And today we're going to be talking about libertarianism and Christianity, and particularly whether or not libertarianism is compatible with Christianity. So yeah, I mean that's pretty basic. It's the topic of the show. People who saw my last video will know this is, of course, what I talked about in that video. And I had some harsh words for those people. But as I said, I want to be polite and charitable if possible. It's just it's like I said on Twitter the other day. I try to be polite, but my enemies are just all so stupid. I think that's a paraphrase of a Trump tweet too. But
very good.
But yeah. So no, sorry. I'm joking. But yes. So yeah. So I don't know, Lambuda, you're the token libertarian here.
Yeah.
Is there anything you'd like to say on this topic?
Well, yes. I think we ought to at least make the distinction between how Christians ought to behave as citizens versus how should Christians look to change the way that governance is handled if they're in power for some reason. And the second, obviously, being a much less important issue because most people don't have any kind of power. But that was probably my initial gambit that I wanted to say. A lot of the verses in the Bible which seem relevant to this discussion, as I read them, look relevant to citizens of nations should be subject to their authorities and don't really, in my opinion, address the question of how should Christians seek to change the government. Yeah, that's just my opening statement, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree that that is sort of in like preparation for this and the previous video and everything. Sort of one of the things that did pop up is that the Bible doesn't say too much about how government should be run, and that's fair. I mean, I do think there are certainly many principles you can get about how governance should be done, but it's also not overly obvious, especially just from the New Testament, how like the ideal Christian government should operate. With that said, there's sort of four angles, I think, to the question of libertarian Christianity. The four angles are the first one is two aspects of this is libertarianism and anarcho-capitalism, because my video was particularly responding to ANCAPs, and of course libertarianism in general does not have to be anarcho-capitalist. You could have non-ANCAP libertarianism. So that's two of the angles. But then there's also, in addition to that, whether this is from just sort of a Bible alone perspective or if this is from an apostolic Christianity perspective. That is, I know apostolic Christianity is perhaps a bit using that term to describe Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy might sound like I'm unfairly privileging them. I'm assuming that they're apostolic, but that's the only term I know to describe both of those without just saying Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy each time, which is a bit annoying.
You could say non-reformed.
Yeah, I guess. But yes. So those are sort of the four perspectives. From Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy, I think it's eminently clear, as I showed in the video, that there's just no way to reconcile these with at the very least anarcho-capitalism, or at the very least, there's no way to there's no way to reconcile the principle that taxation is a sin or government compulsion is a sin with apostolic Christianity. This is just nowhere in the Fathers. The Fathers teach the exact opposite. And furthermore, both of these churches have in the second millennium taught explicitly the opposite also. But as you said, the Bible doesn't really say a lot about governance, so it's a bit vaguer and it's a bit harder to determine exactly. But does anyone else have anything they want to say?
In that, I would also include our Anglican friends, because it's fairly hard to justify the Church of England outside of having an established monarchy. I mean, the whole establishment was founded that the temporal governor should also be the governor of the church. So take that for what you will. So I'd probably include Anglicans alongside us Catholics, the Eastern Orthodox, the Oriental Church, etc. And also the Lutherans. I mean, Martin Luther did constantly side with the kings over the peasants. So it's pretty hard for me to understand how traditional Lutheranism could also reconcile itself. And I'm not too studied on the Westminster Confession, but at the very least, I know Geneva was set up to be more or less governed directly by the church. So even from the perspective of historical Protestantism, it's a very hard thing to unwind the church from at least recognizing tacitly the legitimacy of the state.
I do agree with that. I'd say in practice, almost any Christians that you see in positions of power are not holding consistent libertarian opinions. Either Reformed Christians like me, or indeed, Catholics. In some ways, it makes a lot of sense if you are within one of the two churches, the Orthodox or the Catholic Church, that you would want to see a reflection of the big structured governance of your church in the country. So I wouldn't be surprised if you found that most libertarians who call themselves Christians end up in a denomination like Baptist, which also runs their churches in this kind of distributed, almost ANCAP kind of way. And given that the Bible's not particularly clear, maybe all the verses, when you then interpret them, you end up leaning towards your personal preferences for how you think the government should be run from logic outside the Bible.
Historically, Baptists in particular were definitely quite connected to the classical liberalism. There's actually in like some of the documents. There, I think there's something like the 5 Baptist principles or something that was in the 1800s that really popular, and one of them was absolute freedom of religion. So sort of classical liberalism. I know it seems weird because today, Southern Baptists are the most conservative group in America, or one of the most conservative groups. But historically, it was quite connected to sort of classical liberalism.
Yeah. So the Anabaptists, for example, literally said anything to do with the state is evil, and anybody who has anything to do with it is just wrong. But then they also said if you sinned in any way after being converted, then you should then be removed from society. So maybe they were a bit schizophrenic in that. And, but even
I was just going to say, didn't the Anabaptists eventually become the Amish?
I think you might be right there. Yeah.
But yeah, I think the Amish are one type of Anabaptist. There's multiple different branches.
Another thing to keep in mind is that the Anabaptists themselves were originally rebellious. They wanted to rebel against the authorities and establish their own kind of governing society. But what ended up happening was they got thoroughly trashed and later on became more or less pacifistic.
Yeah. And I actually trace my sort of theological ancestry more to the Dutch Reformed groups and the likes of Kuyper. And although his thinking and his writing seems quite radical, in fact, the way that he handled his statecraft was very normal. So again, we see in practice, it's hard to carry out these libertarian principles. But where I would put a stake in the ground is I think the libertarians are absolutely correct on economic analysis. So if you're answering questions about economics and what the effects of different economic government actions would be, I would go full Austrian on that front. I think that's totally consistent with Christianity.
I'll just say one thing. There needs to be a distinction drawn between prudential libertarianism and moral libertarianism. I think there can be a good case for prudential libertarianism, that a small government policy, for example, or maybe as a general rule, are more efficient than big government policies. And I think that's defensible. And I don't think that there's anyone who would disagree with it. Like, for example, you don't believe the laundry service should be nationalized? Well, congratulations, you believe in at least a small government with regard to that. However, and that's good. However, I think when it comes to policy disagreements, you don't need to invoke scripture. We just need to assess the best political science, social sciences, etc. Make the best arguments on those grounds. However, when you drag like, oh, it's absolutely wrong in all circumstances to use a form of coercion like taxation, at that point, I don't think that's going to work, because scripture seems to contradict that idea, given the fact that it does give authorities an air of legitimacy. So I think moral libertarianism would be my main disagreement, but I'm always open to a prudential libertarianism. I think we could always discuss differences there. And economics is something we can have a good disagreement with. I might disagree with Lambda on something like a living wage, but at the end of the day, although that's actually something which is supported by papal encyclicals, but at the end of the day, we can still have an agreement on or a disagreement on what's the best way to go about getting that. Now, when it comes to something like, I don't know, a government service, I think, is absolutely essential. And I know libertarians have heard this one countless times, and be prepared to have your eyes rolled, but public road services, I don't think you could have that by private companies alone. The whole key to market competition, in my estimation, is that everyone has the resources and the space to build and compete with one another. However, when it comes to road services, I think it would be drastically inefficient to have multiple private roads overlapping and overbuilding on one another. It seems to me far too complicated a procedure, and it would just be more efficient to have like one central monopoly planning that whole thing out. So like that would be if Lambda disagrees with me on that one, that's fine.
I do disagree. But I agree on the sense that
rank
this is
statism.
This is a topic that is addressed outside of going for biblical or indeed, tradition arguments, isn't it? Largely. Well, I don't know. Is there church teaching about road building?
Not that I'm aware of.
No, I don't think so.
I do know that the papacy tried to frustrate efforts to build railways in the papal states, but I don't think that was direct church teaching.
Yeah, I mean, it would be impossible for it would be impossible for private industry to build a railroad for the same reasons John Fisher laid out, except that all of the first railways built were all done through private entrepreneurship. Anyway.
Yeah, if I can jump in here for a second.
No, I'm kidding.
Yeah, you guys suck. I'm out. I'm back. So anyways, that got me sidetracked. Okay, so yes, Lambda's point. So libertarianism, I think, is joined inexorably with economics, free market economics. And I think you can sort of separate the two, right? So like with Lambda, I would generally essentially agree that Austrian economics is correct. Now, what you do with that information is another matter. So you could say, so for example, like I'll just use South Africa where I live as an example. So I could say, yes, if we get rid of farm subsidies or tariffs, let's say we get rid of tariffs on agricultural goods, that's going to lower the price of maize, and that'll be good for consumers. But on the other hand, we're going to put out a lot of farmers, and life in the countryside will be degraded and unsustainable, and a lot of people will flood in the cities and increase, urbanization. So you can say, on the one hand, yes, you can understand that economically speaking, if you want to increase efficiency, Austrian economics is the way to go. But let's say that your values are, somewhat reactionary, and you're like, I want to preserve a way of life. I don't want economic growth. Or I want to preserve a way of life and but the trade-off of that is slowing down economic growth. So we're not going to like stagnate, not total Luddite, but that is a trade-off which you can make while sort of understanding, I think, Austrian economics. So that's sort of a point that I like to sort of throw in there. Likewise with any sort of other things. Trade, I think, is the most probably common one, which could be sort of thought of in this way. But as far as the applicability of libertarianism with Christianity, generally speaking, so leave the economic stuff aside, I'm not sure, but I may be the only one here who was like an ANCAP for an extended period of time. And I was a Christian during that period of time, sort of a non-denominational evangelical Christian. And the reason being was partially for the economic reasons, but also in my moral understanding, just the non-aggression principle. I'm like, it's very simple. If I commit violence, then that's wrong. And therefore, the state shouldn't commit violence. Therefore, there shouldn't be a state. And that was my thinking at the time. I don't think that anymore. But I think that maybe sort of the focus of this discussion, maybe going forward a bit, should be why is that sort of thinking wrong? Why is I guess you could say, the libertarian ethic possibly incorrect? And sort of what eventually sort of brought me around to not going that way anymore was simply just believing that the problem with libertarianism is essentially the problem with communism, in that the communists were never able to create the new Soviet man to have their system work, and libertarians could never have a world where there's the voluntarist man in big enough numbers to make a difference and sort of sustain a system. And because of that, and the fallen world that we live in, the Lord has so ordained that we should have rulers. Now, it's not ideal, and as I understand it, a given ruler can be unjust and deserve chastisement and be removed, but the position of the office itself has a legitimate authority. So, and I think that's sort of the line that Christians have to walk. On the one hand, yes, there is legitimate authority, but sort of where that is and when does it need to be corrected is sort of where this all gets complicated.
May I add something there? When it comes to the idea of aggression, what counts as aggression? I think that is not supportable as a deontological principle, and I think that's where I would take one of my first issues with the libertarian ethic. So, just as a thought experiment, let's assume that I shine like a flashlight on your property. I don't think, in my estimation, that would count as a form of aggression. And I don't think I'm doing anything wrong by shining a flashlight. You can't really just get out the McNuke just because a bit of extra light gets on your property. But let's go to the other extreme, where I'm shining stadium lights at your house. I think it would be fair to say that extreme is a form of aggression. Now,
I think that these issues have been thought of, and if you go to more subtle forms of libertarianism, they will be able to make that distinction without difficulty.
Just to finish it off really quickly, just to show where it goes in practice rather than theory. Now, I'm not saying that because you can't really identify something in the middle there where aggression does and doesn't take place, doesn't mean there isn't a place. So, for example, there's a difference between one speck of sand and a pile of sand. Even though I don't know at what point it piles on, it becomes like the full pile, doesn't mean there isn't a distinction. Just like if I have someone who has a clean shave and a beard, just because I don't know what shade in between, it ceases to be scruff and becomes a beard, doesn't mean there isn't a difference. My only point is, for all practical purposes, the amount of light that is shined on your property is going to be determined as being aggression only to the point where a company on the free market is willing to defend your house in light of that aggression, or prosecute you or get you in trouble if you were to retaliate, or rescue you from trouble if you were to retaliate. Basically, it becomes a point of when the rest of society, and by that I mean when the rest of the market would be supportive of your action as opposed to the other person's action. And at that point, that's more of that becomes more in practice a matter of contractarianism, whether or not everyone agrees there, which isn't a deontological principle, which is it's good or wrong in and of itself. And I think in practice, that's essentially what reducing everything down to a free market gets you, which isn't bad. Which isn't bad, because remember, a free market can be an efficient means to sort out these things. My only point is the free market seems to go into an issue of prudence rather than being marked by companies who are like very intent on finding the moral truth of the matter, which is why I think libertarianism doesn't really boil down that well when it's looked inside of a moral frame with its absolute free market viewpoints. So
I think you're describing an anarchist system that all property right disputes are settled by the free market. But there are other models. I mean, if there is a state which is responsible for ensuring that people don't have their principles stepped upon, that state can have total power in that realm, and those decisions be made, absent the free market. So you build maybe this is the wrong term, but you build a safe space in which the free market may operate.
Oh, no. So I don't disagree with that. I think a state is necessary. I think some form of aggression is necessary. But at that point, I think that you can't really have like a consistent anarcho-capitalist, all aggression is wrong moral viewpoint. I think that to have some form of free market, some form of efficiency, I think we do need a level of state intervention just to get things grounded from the bottom up, just like as a foundation. My only point is I don't think like a thoroughgoing moralist libertarian system that's completely ANCAP is at all consistent with itself, and that's my only point here. Now, I think that a Christian can be a libertarian of sorts. I think they could be like a prudential libertarian. I think that if you look at somebody like Milton Friedman, but let's assume he has more socially conservative viewpoints. Yeah, I think that's fully good. And I don't even think many libertarians would say he wasn't one. Or if you were to look at somebody like a better example would be Thomas Sowell, who is more of a conservative leaning libertarian. I think that's all well and fine. I think it's only when you get to like the Rothbardian moral ANCAP system, I think at that point, that's where I think the Christian should get off the train. I think that's inconsistent with Christian teaching. If you look at somebody like what's his name, Milton Friedman's son, David Friedman, I think his system could even be adapted by someone who's more consistently Catholic or Protestant or Orthodox, just Christian in general. And he's an ANCAP, but he's a consequentialist about it. He'll say it's just a prudential matter. I think even that's fine. I think it's only like that Rothbardian school, which I would say has moral consistency issues, not even just with Christianity, but even in and of itself.
Well, hold on. I'm in defense of my old ANCAP brethren, and just sort of looking at sort of what Radlib's been madly typing in the chat here. I think for the purposes of this discussion, I would like to sort of focus on the moral qualms of libertarianism with state authority. So fundamentally, what libertarianism is it's a moral proposition. The non-aggression principle is that old meme, don't hurt people and don't take their stuff. Now, I want you guys to tell me, why is it okay to hurt people and take their stuff?
I think the sort of the most fundamental way for a Christian to solve the that like moral dilemma that ANCAPs tried to create comes from our old friend Romans 13, where it says that if you don't obey the prince, you will incur judgment. I can get the exact text up. But the point is, you have a duty to obey civil authorities that are above you. So in the ANCAP conception, they always want to make it that there's no difference between the state telling you to do something and like your three friends demanding that you give them their wallet, because that's democracy. If it's like if there's four people, your three friends, they say, "I want your wallet," that's as legitimate as the state that rules over you. And I don't know, maybe you could make an argument from a secular point of view that governments are no different than that. I mean, I don't think you really could. I think you could probably establish through natural philosophy that governments are legitimate also, but at the very least through the teaching of the church and through divine revelation, I think it's quite clear that governments do have authority. And if you're disobeying that authority, you're the one that's you're the one that's messing up. It's not the government that's messing up. There's no fault in the government trying to enforce its rightful authority.
Just to add something there, when you say take your stuff, you have to define what it means for something to be yours, and we have to make a distinction between something in which you own and something in which you possess. For example, right now, they're in my hands. I possess these glasses, but I also do own these glasses. If someone was to take possession of them, I could get these back, well, hopefully, by recourse of state authority, police systems, some kind of justice system. In order for an establishment of ownership to be meaningful, you have to have some kind of system that recognizes such a legitimacy in the first place. And I think at that point, this is why you need a state, at least as on a foundational level. You need to have a state at the very least to designate what constitutes possession as opposed to ownership. And you also have to designate a system that will have a means of sorting that out in a way which is at best and most efficient. Now, if somebody,
I would dispute this. I think that the concept of ownership, it can exist whether or not it's recognized, and in fact, I think it's extremely intuitive, and most people throughout history have known what it means to own, and if they feel they have ownership of something and then that ownership is ignored by the wider society, that doesn't become a just thing to have happened simply because the wider society refuses to acknowledge that this natural state of ownership exists.
So my only point is, yes, let's assume that the whole world ignores it. It still remains an unjust thing. Yeah, fair enough. My only point is, from a practical matter, the idea of just and unjust become meaningless unless there is some kind of authority in order to organize that, in order to enforce that moral precept. Unless there is some authority to recognize and enforce that moral precept, the idea is basically, for all intents and purposes, not going to be beneficial to me in one way or another. And that's why at some base you do need somebody to come in and enforce that. Otherwise, there is in practical effect no distinction between the ownership and possession. It's just somebody who is stronger possessing one thing over another person, and it's just at that point you don't really have a way of exerting your right, your intuition. You don't really have anyone to make that case to. And I think at that point you need some kind of system and some kind of mechanism.
In the case of the Ten Commandments, when you're coveting something belonging to your neighbor, does that not inherently assume that people reading those commandments understood ownership?
They did, but remember, Moses was there as a judge over Israel. He was a prophet, as well as a God who would enforce the covenant himself. When the Jews ignored these moral precepts, God would punish them, and rightfully so, because that was how the law was encouraged, and that's how God reminded them of the law. And unless God saw it right to step in and enforce that law, he knew that that covenant would be meaningless. So even in that, with that example, you always have some kind of governing body to enforce the law, whether it was judges in the book of Judges, whether it was kings in 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings, whether it was the Sanhedrin much later on. There always needed to be some kind of adjudicating body.
So the question issue is, should our system acknowledge ownership? And I think clearly the answer is yes.
Mm-hmm. I would agree. I definitely think it should acknowledge ownership, and I think it should acknowledge a distinction between ownership and possession. My only point is, in having a system that takes place at the bottom level, defining it, putting in together a system of legislation to dictate what constitutes it, assigning people to adjudicate those issues. When it's doing all of that at that point, it's making that distinction not just a true one, but also a meaningful one and a practical one.
Libertarianism is the only system which enforces ownership. Anything else fails to do so.
I would.
Well, if you agree, then syllogistically, then you must be a libertarian.
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, it's the only one.
Could you explain what exactly you mean by that?
Yes. So any system which doesn't acknowledge, I guess the real tricky bit there is libertarianism the same thing as acknowledging private property? And I guess there are bits of the discussion, like the moral side of things, that probably are outside that discussion. But on the economic front, in terms of, is taxation wrong? Should the government be able to take your stuff off of you? I think if it's your stuff that you've produced, you've put your work into it, and you now own it, and then that is taken away from you against your will, that is by definition not acknowledging it's not enforcing ownership. It's saying that thing does not fully belong to you. And even weaker forms of socialism, if you don't fully have control over the things that are your possession, likewise is not a proper definition of ownership.
Well, I feel like I feel like this is fundamentally mixing up what property and ownership is. Because essentially in the libertarian, and again, especially the anarcho-capitalist conception, property and sovereignty are synonyms. If you own your house, you should have full sovereignty over your house. But this is just not how any society has ever defined ownership for anyone other than the king, perhaps. For in all societies, always, other than, I don't know, whatever libertarian experiments have existed, and the early United States is certainly not an example of complete libertarianism. There has always
true libertarianism has never been tried.
no, exactly. There has always been a distinction between property and sovereignty. That you can own something, you can have a great deal of rights of how that thing is used and what you do with it. But that doesn't mean that your ownership over it allows you to do whatever you want.
Well, I think if you own something and it is your property, then you can do whatever you want with it. To whatever extent that's not true, you don't really own it.
I mean, I just don't see why that would need to be the case.
Well, you could nominally claim that you own something and have absolutely no control over it. It would make it makes no practical.
Well, I mean, there's gradients of control. So like for example, let's take like firearm regulations. Let's say you live in a society where there is a relatively liberal firearm laws. You're able to own them, you're able to use them, all that type of stuff. But there's still restrictions that you can't use them in certain areas. I mean, is that saying that you don't own them in those areas?
Yeah, I think so. So the libertarian position, the extreme version, which is everybody has complete control over their property with no restrictions whatsoever, I guess you could criticize it on moral grounds. For example, your children, you probably should have complete control over how you raise them, but at some point your society should probably intervene to prevent child abuse. So maybe there's an example where I would be willing to compromise on for a higher principle. But that would be in answer in some ways to Mr. Patriarch's challenge of when should you be able to use violence and take people's stuff. Well, if they are, well, I guess in the case of child abuse, they are violating the non-aggression principle, but to another person who is their child.
Well, so maybe just to hammer in the whole issue of and distinction between property and sovereignty. The reason why we have property is because it serves some kind of end. After all, that's why God creates everything. Everything has its own telos or purpose or end. And one of them is to sustain life. That's why God gives everyone property. But ultimately, everything that God creates is his and owns. Mm-hmm. Everything that we have and we can claim as property and own possession is just secondhand. Now, if that's the main purpose, then property is a second order good, not a first order good. So the first order good is for the benefit of human life. And the second order good is, of course, owning and possessing that property. So just to give a bit of a thought experiment, imagine for a moment, somebody crash lands onto a desert island and they mix their labor with the land. They cultivate it, they farm it, and after which, for some time, another person manages to get on that once barren land. Now, you have all the means of taking care of them, but would anyone say that property holder has a right to say, get off my island? You could go out into the sea, you can do whatever you want there, but everything I cultivated is mine. Now, in my estimation, I think because property and land is given, and you can make one claim about how somebody cultivates that land and takes possession, but to say that you have therefore an exclusive right to harm somebody or to lead somebody to harm and not at least provide some basic provisions, I think you're violating the very purpose of that property, which is to take care of human beings. And now we do it now in regular society. We have possession in order that families and individuals can take care of themselves, but it exists for a very end or reason to take care of everyone. Now, the reason why the church has always traditionally supported private property is because private property is something which, when you love and cherish, you can cultivate on your own. And it ultimately means it's going to be a lot more efficient if individuals have a lot of control over their property as possible. And we could see how when you just collectivize everything, it didn't really work out that well in Russia, specifically in the Soviet Union era. But as far as I understand it, the church the reason the church calls it a second order good is because unless it's serving its purpose of taking care of human beings, then you're really betraying the reason why you have it. And just to use another thought experiment, imagine you are freezing, it's below zero, and you see a cabin. Do you think you would have a right to just break in there for warmth and survival? I would personally think you do. No matter what the private property owner of that cabin would have to say about it. Yes, sure, we could talk about having to pay reparations later, but I still think that someone would be justified in assuming that they would have a right for their own survival benefit because that comes before property. So that's what I'd have to say.
I think on that last example, you're saying that property rights don't exist.
Oh, no, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying it's a second order right. The first so a first order right is something you have complete control over. It's absolute and it's not contingent upon anything. A second order right is contingent upon something else. And it's a second order right because it's contingent upon the welfare of society and of human beings. That's why we have individual private property. It's for the good of individuals and the whole. That's why the church recognizes that property is best when it is taken care of by individuals and when they have, for the most part, possession, but it's only when it serves that particular end, which is the cultivation of human life.
Gotcha. So what you're saying is private property exists, but it's useful insofar as it advances a higher moral objective, right?
Exactly.
Okay. So if I'm going to a little bit of a South African trivia for you, there's an excellent example of Ancapistan right here in South Africa, believe it or not. So there is a town called Oranje. Now, what happened is after apartheid was on the way out, and what they were able to negotiate is they were able to buy some land, privately owned land in the Northern Cape province, which is this shitty, just arid land that nobody wants. And the government, the ANC, was like, okay, cool, you can buy this land and, it'll be yours and you can do what you want there. So what's happened since then is it's become basically an Afrikaner enclave. And if you want to live in Oranje, you have to basically be approved by a committee of people who live in Oranje if you want to go there. And they're like, well, you better speak Afrikaans and you better fit in and you better be, a Dutch Reformed NG Kerk, church member attendee and so on and so forth. And, and then they'll sort of let you in. So what we see and what we have there is a situation that works quite well. Oranje is a town that has basically no crime compared to the rest of South Africa. It's very safe. There's a lot of communal sort of integrity. It's a very conservative town. And, also not diverse, which sort of makes the ANC mad, but it is what it is. Mm-hmm. Now, to me personally, I look at a situation like Oranje, mm-hmm. which is, in a sense, kind of, now of course, they have to deal with the law and stuff, but it's kind of what ANCAPs would like to see, but sort of spread and proliferated and sort of universalized. So you have these privately owned towns that sort of function with a community trust, and they're able to sort of decide who comes in and so on and so forth. Now, the question is at what point is this unsustainable, right? And to me, it would appear unsustainable when you're sort of dealing with sort of much broader scope and scale, right? So a situation like this is able to persist on a small level. So you can have the town of Oranje, which is privately owned, but as things get bigger, things get a little more complicated. Now you have to start dealing with trade. Now you have to start dealing with, Bantus and Xhosas who live over there. And now you have a very well-to-do town, and then you've got people setting up informal settlements in shanty towns outside of your town. And now they're starting to rob the residents, and now you're sort of having problems and so forth. So there comes a certain point at which you need to have force to enforce these contracts. You need to be able to force people to do things. Now, the ANCAP could say, well, we could have private arbitration agencies. And so and this is sort of something David Friedman said, you can give your money to a private rights enforcement agency that supports the rights of its members, but then, and that's sort of what he argues. The problem I see inevitably is that is the scale issue. That's ultimately the big problem with libertarianism. So now let's say the whole world was like Oranje, but hold on, Angola, which is just north, and Namibia, they're still states, and maybe they want to take Oranje. Well, what you could do is you could have sort of a private sort of self-defense initiative, and Oranje defends itself. But the problem is if you just look at history, we see tons of examples of small states who could band together and could defend themselves against an invading force, but for whatever reason they don't. So whether that's Italy or some smaller states in the Balkans, these people just can't get along, and you could call that an instance of market failure, right? It's not really an economic process, but it's a situation where the goods of sort of doing what I want to do actually end up making it worse for me and everybody else. So I think it's essentially the big problem with libertarianism, and sort of the thing that the reason why God has ordained a ruler, right? And then it can be different in different sort of systems, is that the Lord recognizes that this is going to happen, right? So he's like, look, yes, it's like it would all be great in Shangri-La if you could just sort of get along and whatever, but if you guys sort of do your own thing, you guys are all selfish and you're not going to work together. So there needs to be someone over you to sort of keep the ship going straight. And yes, they will be corrupted. Yes, they're going to run the ship onto the rock sometimes. Yes, they may break a mast and whatever, or they may sink the ship in some cases and everybody dies. That can happen too. But it's unfortunately I think the only situation we have now. One of the things that libertarians will like to bring up is and I put it in the private chat if you guys want to read it, is that passage from Samuel 8. And I'll just read here for the audience. It says, 1 Samuel chapter 8 says, when Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons as Israel's leaders. The name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second was Abijah, and they served at Beersheba. But his sons did not follow his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gains and accepted bribes and perverted justice. So all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Saul at Ramah. They said to him, now you are old, and your sons do not follow your ways. Now appoint a king to lead us, such as all the other nations have. But when they said, give us a king to lead us, this displeased Saul. So he prayed to the Lord, and the Lord told him, listen to all that the people are saying to you. It is not you they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king, as they have done from the day I brought them up out of Egypt until this day, forsaking me and serving other gods. So the libertarian interpretation of this passage is like, see, the people want a king, and if they only follow God, they wouldn't need a king. I think there's a couple of ways that could be challenged in this passage. First, Saul was essentially, he was a judge, but we could think about him essentially as almost a divinely appointed, a God-ordained dictator of the Jews in a certain sense, right? I mean, that's sort of how he functioned. Yes, there wasn't the state, right? But he functioned as sort of like the head man of the tribes. And secondly, it says a king like the other nations around us. Now, what were the other nations around him? There were the Philistines and people sacrificing children to Moloch and all sorts of stuff. You did not want a king like other nations. And the other part is, it says they have rejected me, not you. So I think the issue with the Israelites, it wasn't that they didn't need a leader. They did, which is why they had Saul. But they didn't trust the Lord to appoint a man to lead them when in the Lord's own good time. So it's not so cut and dry to me that all leaders are breaking the NAP and are illegitimate. Seems like there's a little bit of complexity here. What are your guys' takes sort of on this passage from the libertarian angle?
Well, yeah, I mean, prior to that passage, Israel obviously already had coercive laws that were enforced because the laws that were given to Moses had already been enforced for a long time. And that was not in, I mean, I don't know how you could even enforce those laws in an anarcho-capitalist way. So it's like it's clear that Israel was not Ancapistan prior to that.
One thing to keep in mind is even in the book of Judges, they were still ruled by the judges, which is kind of how the United States is operated. It is ruled by judges. But a little joke, none of us is American. I should probably stop mentioning them. In any case, we
It's okay. I'm an American in exile. So it's
oh,
all right.
okay, fair enough. So, in any case, aside from that little joke about judicial rule, it also corresponds really well with other passages in the Bible, which seem to heavily emphasize the role of the king. In 1 Peter 2:17, we read, "Honor all men, love the brotherhood, fear God, and honor the emperor." And I'm sorry if I'm just going to splurge out these Bible verses, but my point is, yes, maybe one of them can be interpreted in a way which is favorable to anarcho-capitalists, but I don't think it could be said for all of them. In Daniel chapter 2, verse 21, we read, "He changes the times and the seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding." Proverbs 24, verses 21 to 22, "My son, fear the Lord and the king, and do not disobey either of them. For disaster from them will rise suddenly, and who knows the ruin that will come from both." And lastly, 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 1 to 2. "First of all, I urge that supplications, prayers, intercessions, thanksgiving be made for all men, for kings, and all who are in high positions, that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life, godly and respecting in every way." So now I know the quick response is, okay, yes, it says to pray for these people, but that doesn't take away from the fact that they're very coercive and evil. It just says that it's just what's good for them. Don't rock the boat, and it's just for practical purposes. But if you read these verses, they seem to emphasize that these authorities are not just necessary to pacify for the goodness of people, but they're integral. For example, the point of Paul in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 1 to 2 is that they may lead a quiet and peaceable life, godly and respectful in every way. It's for the good. The prayer for the king is part of the good of all. If you read 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 17, when he says, "Honor the emperor," and God, he's saying that these two things are tied with one another. One comes after the other. And just to go back to Proverbs, when you don't fear the Lord as you fear the king, when you don't fear the king as you fear the Lord, or disobey either of them, disaster will suddenly rise, and who knows what kind of ruin will come from both. They're given a comparison or a conjunct. These are kind of given similar senses. They're not really too disentangled from the text. None of the authors are really trying to make a strong distinction between the two. I'm not saying that there isn't a distinction, but it seems like honoring the proper ruling authorities is part and parcel of the Christian life, and it seems to be quintessential for living a peaceable life in this time, at the very least. So
it feels like a lot of the points being made are not necessarily things that libertarians would disagree with. I mean, saying that you should obey the current authorities isn't a refutation of libertarianism.
Well, if they have their position by coercion or by a dint of evil, it means that they're in a position I would not say is good when you're comparing it with the position God has, who has his position of authority because he is good in and of himself.
But you can't
it seems
surely
like
believe that the New Testament writers were thinking that the Roman Empire was good in the same way that God is good.
What I am saying is that the early Christians would have at least have had to say that they had the same legitimacy to rule. they had a legitimacy to rule that, at the very least, derives from God's will.
Yeah, which again, I don't think is something that libertarians would disagree with.
Well, no, libertarians don't believe
ANCAPs
government
would not believe that anyone has a legitimacy to rule.
Yeah.
At least if you're an ANCAP for
think-
principled reasons.
Well, I think an ANCAP might say this is the way that society would be best set up. But given that we're not in that situation, as Christians, we believe that the current situation has an authority from God and you should obey it, even though it's not ideal.
Well, if it something
Well,
that you should.
I mean, if taxation and government coercion are sins, and again, I want to distinguish here, like that position from ANCAPs who would just say that it's just like this just would produce the best society, but taxation and coercion are not necessarily sins. But if we are taking the principle, take that those are sins, then God would not tell you to obey sins.
But if the person who's in authority over you is doing something immoral and, taking things from you or whipping you or cutting your arm off, and you submit to that, you're not necessarily endorsing that behavior. All you're doing is you're acknowledging that person is in authority in the will of God. And as a Christian, our primary purpose is not to be part of a political revolution. We need to acknowledge that a lot of the things that the Christians in the New Testament were being asked to go along with were clearly immoral and against God's will. And yet,
Yes.
as subjects of the rulers, the Christians were being encouraged to act well. And the principle is basically, if you are good, the rulers won't particularly come after you.
There strikes me as being a bit of a distinction, though, between somebody who is, let's say, cutting my hand off, and I'm just submitting to it. I'm not fighting against it, and I'm just taking it because I don't know, maybe some kind of worse evil will visit me, as opposed to a ruler. Like, for example, in the book of Proverbs, when Solomon says, "My son, fear the Lord and the king, and do not disobey either of them. For disaster from them will suddenly arise, and who knows what will come from both." It seems that in that one, fearing God and fearing the king is a good thing. Now, something needs to be distinguished here. In Proverbs, the king was somebody who God directly appointed, not an evil emperor. At the very least, it seems that when the king is acting godly, that is something to be compared to a good as God would see it. Like, God is directly appointing these people over Israel, and Solomon himself is, and I don't think Solomon himself would have had the intention of saying, "Well, yeah, I'm kind of this necessary evil that goes on here."
By analogy, to think about other things that the Bible encourages us to be subject to. For example, children should be subject to their parents. Now, most of us have heard expositions of this that have gone into exactly the same question. What if your parents are doing something, that's immoral? And the principle is, if what your parents are doing is immoral, but within limits, you go along with it because it's right as a child. So your parents there's lots of ways in which your parents can be sinful in a small way. And they might, I'm trying to think of a small example. So suppose your parents
functioning alcoholics or something.
Yeah. Okay. That's a good example. So they're terrible alcoholics. And if they weren't your parents, when they drunkenly, I don't know. I'm trying to think of a
just to use the example of Noah, like his son, after he got drunk, his sons covered him up. No, and I do get that comparison, but somebody is a parent by dint of the fact that they give you life. And no one would say giving life to a child is in and of itself a bad thing. But someone is your authority by dint of claiming legitimacy over you, and a right to control and rule you, and a right to your property and certain amounts of possessions. When someone becomes your parent, we consider that to be a good thing. They have an air of legitimacy in light of that relationship. But if the relationship, that which grounds you as a state or grounds you as a ruler, is evil, then I don't see how the rest of it, or what follows from the rest of it, would entail something other than evil itself. So at the very least, I think that's the main distinction between comparing with the parent and comparing with the state. The state,
But if the instruction is not to be a good child only if your parents are perfect. But likewise, just saying you should be subject to your parents isn't saying, well, there's no parenting handbook, there's no best principles. And the libertarians' points are, how should the government behave? So any question about whether or not Christians should be subject to authorities seems kind of irrelevant to the debate.
So just to emphasize this once more, this is the per se libertarian, the one who says that any form of claim of legitimacy over you and authority over you is wrong in and of itself. That's the only position I'm
not
critiquing.
Any sort of authority.
So not sort of any sort of non-voluntary authority.
Yeah.
So we've taken down the straw man that not very few people actually believe, I think, successfully. But that still leaves most libertarians, I would think.
But my only point was that there seems to be at root an air of legitimacy that the state has over you. And it's not something you agreed with at any point in your life. It's not like you've made some kind of explicit agreement, maybe an implicit one, but I won't get into that. The point is that the very libertarians who have that per se moral belief think that any kind of authority claimed over you that isn't voluntary is in and of itself wrong. My only point is, that's the exact relationship that Solomon claimed over Israel by dint of his own office. And he seems to be comparing his office to God, and he seems to be saying, you have to fear the king as you fear the Lord. And I don't think I would understand him as implying in his wisdom that, his claim to that sort of non-voluntary legitimacy is just him making the best out of a bad situation.
Yeah, but again, you're taking down an argument that nobody is, I think, putting forwards.
That all rulers who claim an authority to rule, regardless of whether or not someone consented to that rulership, is wrong. I think that there are some anarcho-capitalists who believe
there
that.
may be some, but it's not. Well, it's not a position I'm defending. Sorry, Mr. Patriarch, I interrupted you earlier.
Well, I'm sorry, but I just to not bring this off the topic, but my understanding is that is the ANCAP position. This is what I've talked with them. They think any non-voluntary rulership is immoral. That seems to be what Fisher is trying to respond.
Fair enough. In that case, maybe I've misunderstood that subset of ANCAPs.
If you're a libertarian who thinks there's legitimacy for the state, then
my understanding is that is the ANCAP view.
Okay. Well, there you go.
Yeah, and that's the only position I was critiquing. There are many minarchists who believe some state rulership is legitimate. That's fair enough. There are some who think that if you expand the free market, you get a more efficient society, and government role should just be minimized based off that. I'm not even critiquing that one. I
think there's another interesting question, which is, if I was setting up a society from scratch, I would have one set of principles in mind.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a different question of how should we behave given the society is where it is, and we're thinking about potentially trying to change it in small incremental ways. And there's a lot of issues that come into that question, which I think economics don't address. Questions about power, questions about tactics and who's on our side and who isn't. That's a whole nother can of worms. I don't know if we want to open those up.
So
perhaps
what do we do now, essentially?
Yes. So for example, I think that a lot of time and effort is wasted by groups who I fundamentally agree with as libertarians, but their approaches seem counterproductive. and it's kind of a different question to whether their principles are fundamentally correct.
Okay, so I think I see where you're coming from. So, for example, what I would just me talking personally, right? The goals of a lot of libertarians are also my own, in terms of minimizing the sort of managerial state, which is socially engineering everyone in an unhealthy way, which is pushing, sort of degenerate behavior, which is dysgenic and, toxic to the culture and all that sort of stuff. Yes. I want all those things sort of done away with. I want sort of more prosperity. I want sort of a more stable life. I want lower taxes. I want all that. Agreed. But yes, the issue we have is sort of how do we go about doing that? And I would say their approach of let's just convince enough people to, to vote LP and or change enough people's minds so that they're not participating in the system, or they try to do agorism or one of these sort of more out there idea or do seasteading. That's the way to go. I think is totally misguided. So and is that sort of Lambda is that's kind of where you sort of want to take this sort of what now? So sort of with a Christian worldview in mind, with Christian goals, with sort of a biblical objective. How do we sort of achieve that, and how does that diverge from what libertarians in general are trying to do?
Yeah, I suppose before, if we go in that direction, there was one other I wanted to kind of restate in case I wasn't clear enough on my initial position at the beginning of the stream, which I feel I didn't state particularly clearly. So what I'm saying is, I think there may be good reasons to disagree with libertarianism from an a priori perspective, or based on historical evidence, or for pragmatic reasons. But I don't think there's any reason to think that's fundamentally in contradiction with the Bible. And I think that is probably an essential thing to clarify. If we agree on that, there's still lots of scope to go on and discuss whether or not, in fact, we should disagree or agree with libertarianism as an approach. But a lot of the features of that discussion will not be particularly relevant to Christianity. It's in some ways a topic that's not directly addressed in the Bible, I think.
You're right. It isn't directly addressed. And you know what? I'm going to, since I've been the person who's been mostly lobbing attacks at libertarians, I just want to go on to say there are a lot of really good things I do like about libertarians, especially a lot of libertarian thinkers. One of my favorites has been Brian Kaplan. He has a great book against, it's called The Myth of Education.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a really, he should have called it The Myth of Schooling, but basically his whole argument has been government funded schooling is basically measured very imprecisely. For example, a lot of it tends to just be, what's he call it? A lot of it tends to be what's called signaling. Basically, it's based upon saying something is worth more than it really is. So
credentialism is a signaling mechanism.
Exactly. And I've been using those arguments as a way of saying, yeah, this is why we really shouldn't be funding the university system. And you know what? It works a lot better than, that university system. They're just a hive-minded degeneracy. Like that argument is much more convincing to modern ears than my more socially conservative Catholic approach, which sucks, but that's the world I have to work with here. He's also right when it comes to critiquing voting systems. Like a lot of the time when people vote, because they don't put a lot of study or thought into it, they usually go with their gut instincts. And when they go with their gut instincts, it's not based on any deep study into the topic itself. It's basically based on what sounds better. And that's based on not looking at not looking at the evidence, following the news, following the political system. And it's because there's a really low trade-off between being politically informed, because it takes a lot of time and effort, and voting, the act itself, what you have to gain from it immediately. So this is one of the reasons why voting systems tend to suck, democracy in general. And another great solution he has for gaining greater political ground and influence is just have more children. He has another work about how there are good selfish reasons to have more kids. If you have more kids, they're going to be more likely to end up taking care of you later on. And because they're more likely to take care of you later on, it gives you your money back on your investment. Plus, you have more people who are genetically disposed to think like you. And yeah, you have the myth of the rebellious teen, but really, sometimes people are actually more disposed to think like you if they come from you, if you raise them. And if you have like 5 or 6 kids, chances are for that one rebellious child you might have, you have a lot of others who are more likely to take up the mantle and go through and push for your own political ends that would not have been around if it wasn't for all that time, care, and effort you devoted into taking care of them and into educating them. So there are definitely a lot of things we can learn from libertarians. They have a lot of great material, and I think people on the quote-unquote dissident right should actually look into that. So yeah, I don't want to say libertarianism is completely useless. It's a joke. It's not. It's actually a movement that has a lot of smart, influential people, and you definitely should read a lot of their material, even if you disagree, maybe with some of the moral foundations of a certain aspect of it.
Yeah, agreed. And that's why I'm not worried about retirement, because I took Kaplan's advice and I'm going to have a bunch of kids. So there we go. Social Security, not my problem.
Yeah. So go on, carry on.
No, I was going to say I think that's sort of spot on with the money. Libertarianism, I think the strength of libertarianism is its critiquing ability and its sort of analysis of systems and structures, and especially public choice theory, I think, which is it's technically an economic school, but it's very closely linked with libertarianism. I think recognizing that institutions have their own objectives aside from their stated, charter is very important. And I think probably the thing that, it's sort of going back to the title of this, the thing that where libertarianism may sort of depart from where I am is sort of the goals of society at large, right? So that is that, and the whole thing with libertarianism is that it's there are no goals, right? Or you get with like-minded people, you buy a piece of land, and then you execute your goals there if you can, right? So that's kind of the issue. But what were you going to say, Lambda?
I can't remember.
Was it something about that Radlib article you were going to say, or?
Possibly. I just tried to drop it into chat. Radlib wrote an article about the 1 Samuel passage that was mentioned earlier that I think is worth reading. Yeah. So in general, we're saying that there's an interesting discussion to be had about the benefits or otherwise of libertarianism. I think the area so I'm very strong on economics being correctly handled by the Austrians, but the other half of the libertarian philosophy, I believe, is the government should stay out of people's lives morally, and this is an area that I used to believe quite strongly in, and I have been drifting. And I think I'm quite persuaded by some of the arguments that if I don't know, maybe I'm opening it up for discussion. Partly, I think if the society is quite upright morally, adding laws to encourage good behavior will make little difference. You don't really need them. Whereas if the country is entirely degenerate and you try introducing laws to reform individuals' behavior, it probably won't work. I guess that was my original feeling about the topic, but I guess I'm not so clear at this point. I'm more open than I ever was to the idea of using the laws of the government to enforce private moral behavior.
Well,
Again, it's a tactical question, because at this point, I think Christians are a bit on the back foot, and we might be better siding with the liberals on this one, because otherwise they will stop us practicing our religion. That's our risk.
One of the few things that we have to realize is moral degeneracy is an externality. So for those of you who don't know, an externality is something that breeds an ill economic effect if allowed to go unchallenged. So for example, you could think of a company polluting a stream, and that stream being so polluted it ruins everything for the village downscale. So because that's unregulated, it would lead to a bad consequence. Now, what we have to realize is moral degeneracy kind of works in the same way. If you allow some kind of immoral behavior to go unchallenged, some vice to be indulged in, then we end up with an issue where what ends up happening is people are more incentivized to try to keep that up, keep that going, shine the spotlight away, and that just encourages more moral corruption going onward. And sometimes government needs to be there for behavior modification challenges. For instance, up north in Canada, a lot of tribes deal with alcohol issues. And the real sad thing is they need reserves which have no alcohol. Now, granted, sometimes they might break those dry laws, but ultimately they have shown, in my estimation, to have worked. It's much easier to actually make sure small pockets of places are keeping illicit substances out. I know we have that whole, that didn't really work in the United States. Yeah, but the United States is a big country with a huge national law.
The whole I made a video a long time ago about this. The whole prohibition didn't work thing is everyone just went to saloons. This is a total meme. It's made up history. There was a very significant reduction in alcohol consumption, at least 30%.
Right.
I know. The sort of not even necessarily libertarians, but like left-wing liberals will say this too, is the Mountain Bailey they always push is that, it's not going to get rid of it completely. Well, yeah, obviously it's not going to get rid of it completely, but like 30% is significant, like even 10% is significant. Like these can do things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and well, that's actually really good to know. But going forward, my only point is sometimes you do need to modify behavior, and you do need incentives to do so. And we usually just think of it as like stick and no carrot, but you can also incentivize good behavior by giving good rewards for doing certain things. So, for example, making it easier, rewarding women to stay at home. Rewarding the one parent stays at home, one parent works. Model, like actually doing something with our tax codes to make sure that thing can go up and run stably. Yeah, I think that can go a long way. So in the same way that you can use markets, in the same way markets work, you could also create artificial markets, which also do the trick as well.
Yeah. I was seeing a comment that Radical Liberation left a while ago on the Second Samuel passage that I was quoting. So for those who don't know, the Bible goes on to say that Samuel gives the Israelites a talking to. He's like, look, he says the king, he's going to take all your fields. He's going to take your women. He's going to want 1/10 of your flocks, and you're going to be subject to him. And then it says here at the end, when that day comes, you will cry out for relief for the king who you have chosen, but the Lord will not answer you in that day. But the people refused to listen to Samuel. No, they said, we want a king over us. Then we will be like the other nations, with a king to lead us and go out before us and fight our battles. When Samuel heard all that the people said, he repeated it before the Lord, and the Lord answered, "Listen to them, give them a king." So, so there's clearly warning here against power, right? And the power of a king and sort of what he can do. But I think the thing here, the way I sort of understand this passage is that God appointed the ruler through the judges prior to this. And the Israelites were not counting on the Lord to provide them with a leader who would sort of, go forth and whatnot. Also, there's an element here where the Israelites are trying to, they want to emulate their neighbors to a certain degree, and they lack faith. And that sort of, that was and remained and continued to be their problem, essentially. And by choosing a king, what they were doing is they were sort of they were institutionalizing power to a certain extent, and in their mind sort of smoothing out the process and not relying on God to sort of appoint a leader. But like as we mentioned before, the issue wasn't that they had leaders. The issue was that they didn't trust the Lord to appoint somebody to lead them, I think is kind of, I think sort of the takeaway here. What do you guys say?
Do you want my take on this bit?
Sure.
I think what's really going on is it's a question of trying to solve money in politics. The issue was that previously there was no taxation. The judges, therefore, could be bribed. The idea was, let's get a king in and tax. Inevitably, the king will tax. That's the main difference. And if he's getting a wage, he'll no longer be likely to. He's not going to be swayed by people paying him. He'll judge justly. Because of course, as we know, as a result of the wealth that the powerful accrue, they're always incredibly fair in how they behave, and that worked out really well throughout history.
Yeah.
If I could just provide my take.
Sure.
If you read the last verse in the book of Judges, it says, "This is what Israel was like before the king, when everyone didn't follow the law and did what was in their own hearts." Something similar to that, I'm paraphrasing. But in this book of Samuel, we have the opposite problem where the king is being installed. The people want the king and they've rejected God. So we have in the first book a decrial of we have a pro-king book, a pro-monarchy book. In the second book, we seem to have what's more of a pro-republican book, the idea that it should be controlled by a kind of aristocracy as opposed to a king. And that's critiqued too. In my estimation, the issue with the first one is without the king, there was no control. In the second issue is people are supposed to be ruled directly under God, not by a man. So in my understanding, I think that it's showing the two issues with two human governing institutions. It's not saying that we're better off without either of them, but what it is saying is they both leave a lot to be desired. And I think it's a messianic fulfillment because Christ actually combines the best of both. He is a king, just like the kings of Israel are. So it's not choosing king over God, but rather it's choosing man, the man king and the man God together. And on the other hand, it is God directly ruling himself. So it combines the best of both the systems, God ruling directly over Israel, as in the book of Judges, but having a king and a central figure of control like the book of Kings. So I think it is in part a messianic fulfillment and showing the best of both systems in the person of Christ.
Yeah, I actually had not thought of that before. Because, I do remember the ending passage prior to this. It says, "And there was no king, and at that time there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes," or did what he saw fit in his own eyes. So that is, as you say, it's showing a situation where the Israelites have there is a certain lack of control and structure, and because of their sinful nature, they just sort of go hog wild a little bit. But then, as you say in this passage, it is warning that, yes, yeah, you will have a king and he will impose some sort of stability, but he's going to be an asshole. Is essentially it. So it's kind of like there is no solution, perhaps. But as you were saying, and sort of foreshadowing the sort of messianic fulfillment of Christ, who sort of comes in as, you know, the Son of God, the King of Kings, Lord of Lords, and whatnot. But yeah, that's food for thought.
Yeah. Fun fact: are you guys familiar with Charles Clume? Anyone here?
Yeah.
Yeah. I've actually interviewed him on my show, and he actually pointed out that, and this I haven't fact checked him on this one, but I trust his knowledge on it. He says the first time this argument from the Book of Kings was ever, or from Samuel was ever used, was by Thomas Paine, who didn't even believe in the inerrancy of Scripture itself. And he pointed, and John Adams pointed out, it's funny that you got people to believe in something you yourself, Thomas Paine, did not believe. So that is also food for thought as well.
I have a fun little quote from Augustine, if you wanted a little diversion.
Sure.
He says, "Justice being taken away, then, what are kingdoms but great robberies? For what are robberies themselves but little kingdoms?" So I think what Augustine is conflating here, comparing, saying they are essentially the same thing, is a kingdom where you have a king and the king extracts things from his underlings, and a robbery where somebody has power in a very localized setting. They use something like a gun or a sword. They take stuff against the will of the people. So if you agree with Augustine, then you can only defend morally kings extracting against the will of their people morally if you also think that robberies are okay, because they're essentially the same thing. Not saying that if you are in a situation where your choices are either to hand over your wallet or to be shot or have your neck slit, perhaps in that situation you make the practical decision that you will accept the theft. So that is to say, you may choose to go along with taxation. However, it doesn't mean, just because you're going to go along with it doesn't mean that you agree with it fundamentally.
Let's see. Isn't, from what I remember, doesn't he only speak of
God?
Oh, from what I remember, isn't he speaking about kingdoms, specifically ones that don't operate by means of justice? Their laws aren't built on a notion of justice, not necessarily kingdoms per se.
I'm afraid I don't know if that's true. I couldn't see that being the case. I read like a paragraph or two, but maybe in slightly wider context, you're right. Exercise for the listener to go and check that up. It's book 4, chapter 4 of City of God. Anyway.
Oh, wait, here it is. Justice being taken away, then, what are kingdoms but great robberies? For what are robberies themselves but little kingdoms? The band itself is made up by men. It is ruled by the authority of a prince. It is knit together by the pact of a confederacy. The booty is divided by the law agreed upon. If by the admittance of abandoned men, this evil increases to such a degree that it holds place, fixes abodes, taken possession of cities, and subdues people, it assumes the more plainly the name of a kingdom, because the reality is now manifestly confirmed on it. It is not by removal of covetousness, but the addition of impunity. Okay, so it does start off by saying justice being taken away. So he does add that little caveat. And then he says that, okay, when it's not predicated upon a notion of justice, it's basically just a matter of dictates. And I think what this is mostly criticizing is the idea of governments that aren't based in the natural law, but they're more positivistic. So going back to Thomas More, when he challenged the Church of England and the fact that it wasn't predicated on the law of the church, they just said, well, no, the law is whatever the Church of England says it is, or what the Parliament says it is. So I think that's what he's criticizing, just the idea that laws are whatever the government dictates, not necessarily governments when they're operating within the system of the natural law or of the divine law.
Or you could read it that he's saying the only legitimate place for the state is to uphold justice. You're saying you heard it here first, folks. Augustine invented libertarianism.
I think he actually critiques somewhere in The City of God the idea that the only thing the government is fit for is just to uphold property rights. I'm trying to remember where that is. It's been a while since I've read it, but that's what I recall, at least in a discussion about this with my brother.
Well, if we look at to bring that arch libertarian of note, sort of Hans Hermann Hoppe, into the mix, that's actually kind of his argument in a certain sense. Partially is that classically states, monarchies, functioned largely at a much smaller scale than states do to this day. And classically, the king or the czar or whoever would have a lot of authority, and the power would be very centralized, but it would be very limited in what they executed, right? If that makes sense. So the king sort of had a lot of authority to, do this or that, but they weren't involved in a sort of universalizing, micromanaged, the state is in every aspect of your life sort of affair, so much as they had the ability to enforce the law. They had the ability to sort of wage war and raise taxes. But aside from that, most people spent their entire lives, or most of their lives, separate from what the state actually did. So I think that's kind of the ideal goal. Now, of course, we could argue in modern society, the issue we have, I think, is mass society. So things have gotten to such a big scale now that trying to manage the systems and structures that we have sort of presents, I think, some unique challenges that didn't necessarily exist in the past. So where to go from there, I think, is sort of the next big question that needs to get answered. Not here, of course, but just in general.
Yeah, I mean, there's always the argument that one of the issues with having bigger and bigger government structures is it's easier for elites to create these very invasive, large programs. Whereas if you have a system where the governing is mostly done at the local level and authority is more dispersed, yet a little more centralized up top, by which I mean there's one political figure at top who just handles basic oversights. He doesn't have too much, he's not charged with too much day-to-day stuff. But as you go closer to the local level, they have more of a say in local governing affairs. I think that's my preferred system, one that's more bottom up, but at the same time, one which you could exercise more local activity. And I think that we've definitely gone far away from that, especially in a globalist world that we all live in right now. The day of the nation state seems to be more or less gone, which sucks. And even if you look at more classical literature, like if you look at older notions of a republic, like they were very small, geographically speaking. Like you had city-states like the Republic of Venice, as opposed to a republic such as the United States, which encompasses a continent from one end to the other. So yeah, I think by having that much state control over a huge amount of the population, and with more technology where they can supervise us and where we have less control in our day-to-day lives, I think that's really caused us to struggle.
Yeah. Nope. I wouldn't disagree with that. Agreed.
I want to make sure before we finish the stream that we've covered all of the Bible verses that might be brought up in relevance to this. Are there any that we haven't talked about that seem immediately relevant? We kind of covered in passing the idea of give taxes to Caesar, which is in Matthew, I think.
Yes, it is. I don't think I used that one as my example. I used 4 other verses, but render unto Caesar's what is Caesar's, and render unto God's what is God's.
Oh, it appears in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. All
right,
3 of the Synoptic Gospels.
Yeah, it's. I used to have a friend who was an anarcho-capitalist. I'm not sure if he is one now, but he would often take he would use critical Bible studies, and he would take some of the more controversial claims to his position, and he would find reasons why it probably wasn't in the original text, and he would just not consider it inspired. He could not do it with that one because it was in multiple Gospels.
So, mining the Bible, basically.
Yeah, it's not just given to liberals.
Yeah.
Now, I wanted to put forwards one other argument that is a bit more extreme, so strap in. I got this argument from a guy called Nick Watts, and he thinks that taxation is in the same category as slavery, in that biblically lots is written about slavery, negatively, but also how to live under it. And it is very frequently the case that when one group takes over another, as in enslaves them, the actual practical way that this happens is that they have to pay some kind of tribute. So there are various bits of the Bible that he uses as examples for this. I probably won't give those right now because it'll take a bit of time. But his basic point is that there's this kind of taxation like behavior many times through the Bible, and actually it is always treated in a similar way to how slavery is. And it's noted by a lot of modern people that the Bible is not clearly, doesn't actually make doesn't take a lot of time to say how terrible slavery is and it should be abolished. But slavers are criticized. It's not something that people should be doing. But there's actually multiple types of slavery. So, for example, slavery by conquest, which is when you've been violently taken into captivity. Slavery by contract, so if you've got into massive debt and you choose to be a slave for a period of time, and then maybe 1 Samuel 17, slavery as a retribution. But in the case of slavery by contract, the advice actually seems to be you should remain a slave for a period of time, because you went into it voluntarily. It was your choice. You gave up your freedom for a bit. And like Onesimus, for example, is told to go back by Paul. And slavery by conquest, you don't have any choice anyway. I think these are analogous and quite useful in framing thinking about how we live under the government. That is to say, most of us don't have any choice. We live under the government by force. We can't actually choose, and therefore it makes total sense that the biblical advice is we should be subject to those authorities, in much the same way as slaves are instructed to be subject to their masters, not because the masters are necessarily good people or have your best interests at heart, but just because that is the correct Christian way to be a witness to those groups. And if you've got yourself into a voluntary situation, you ought to fulfill what you have agreed to do. So, controversial opinion. I thought it was interesting, worth thinking about, maybe.
No, that is actually a fairly good argument. I think a lot of Christians do have a tough time arguing for the morality of biblical slavery. It it's something that we've spilled a lot of ink over, especially in debating atheists online. But I think maybe the signal difference between taxation for legitimate authorities and slavery is slavery was never presented in Scripture as being for the good of the enslaved. Whereas in Romans chapter 13, we have, for the one in authority is God's servant for your good. But if you do no wrong, be afraid, for rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. Their authority has a purpose, and that purpose is directed for the good. Whereas I'm not too familiar with any passages in Scripture that say slavery is directed for the good. Sometimes, though, in the Old Testament, in order to get out of slavery, if you were a Jew rather than an idolater, after 7 years, you were basically released. So slavery was pretty much a good practical means of getting people to convert. Not only that, but also as a way of getting people to not just convert, but deterring them from becoming idolaters, and even deterring idolaters from taking up their practices in Israel herself and committing what would essentially be a form of treason. So even with that, it's presented as being something which is a good and for itself, that is taxation, whereas I don't really see the parallel with slavery itself.
You're saying you don't see where slavery is shown as being a good
for the enslaved, no.
For the enslaved, whereas the people who are being ruled, it is shown as being a good for for those who are under authority.
Yes, I quoted Romans 13 verse 4.
Well, so what Romans 13 says is that it's linking back to an idea in the Old Testament of the sword of the avenger, right? Or somebody who becomes the avenger.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it's the avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. So in the law of Moses, if you were found to be guilty, somebody would come along, just a random civilian actually, and just like do the execution, chop off somebody's head. And in so doing, they were carrying out justice, and that's a good thing because God is just, and it's right for the society to carry out justice.
In British common law, the equivalent would be someone keeping the king's peace.
Yeah, and in what Romans 13 is saying is like, if you do bad stuff and the state chooses to punish you for it, for example, if the Romans, even though they're horrible, awful group of people who are doing all kinds of immoral stuff, but if you do something evil and the Romans punish you for it, they're doing something that actually does match with God's wishes in that case. So I would say Paul is actually saying, as a Christian, you still might be punished within this life if you do wrong stuff, and that's good if that happens.
Romans 13 does not exclusively talk about punishment, though. It specifically says, for this reason you pay taxes.
And I would also add that it says, even with that interpretation in mind, which I actually really do like, if the emperor is someone deputized by God in a certain sense to keep the king's peace, the king being the Almighty, then in doing so, their end is still for the sake of the good of the person in which they're enacting this justice anyway. So that would also give it the legitimacy it would require, and that would still say it was directed towards the ultimate good or the ultimate end of God's wishes. In which case, I don't really think that it changes the underlying point.
I was going to remark before I had to go on Lambda's last point. I thought it was really good, and it got me excited. So excited I had to go relieve myself.
I often have that effect.
Yeah. So what you're talking about, your discussion that you had with you said Nick, right? About how taxation is kind of analogous to slavery. I would say, yes, it is. Yes, I am ruled by others above me who take my property, and that is somewhat analogous to slavery. It's just a fact. And we have the different kinds of slavery, right? So the person who's in debt, who goes into voluntary servitude. But taxation is not like that. We're kind of born into it in a certain sense. Now, the way I think about it is I sort of think I take that sort of discussion we had earlier about the passage from Samuel and then the passage with Judges. So it's a situation where we are subject to authorities above us who in effect own us to a certain extent. Whether that's right or wrong, that's just a fact of life. But the alternative to that, suppose we were to throw off the yoke, is we would probably just be ruled by some other asshole, right? So if we think about, and it's kind of a glib comment, but if we think about like Byzantium or the Eastern Roman Empire, the alternative to living under Justinian wasn't having a nice little private town with a private rights enforcement agency. The alternative to that was being absorbed by the growing Muslim empire. So that was your choice. You could either support Justinian and try to live under the Christian empire, or you would be conquered by the Muslims, and all that goes with that. So I think, so we are sort of born, taxation is kind of analogous to slavery. It's true, but it's just kind of the condition. Now, of course, what that means also, and what we're talking about earlier in the end of the Judges chapter with the king, is it's a weird paragon, it's a weird paradigm, because on the one hand, yes, it's a system that isn't just and isn't nice, but we have these rulers, and if they are in that position, they have the obligation to try and exercise justice according to God's will, as we said. So I think it's just sort of, it's one of those things where it's kind of just one of those unfortunate fallen world sort of scenarios. So that, yeah, taxation is slavery. Yes, the state owns me to a certain extent. Yes, in the absence of the state, things would be better. But that would only be in the absence of all states, because I would probably be under the yoke of somebody else. Someone is going to be on top, period. Therefore, that person should, to the best of their ability, try to exercise God's law and not be too onerous on me. So I don't know. That's just sort of my take.
Just so we can answer rather quickly Josh's comment in the when he says, did Paul violate Romans 13 when he got thrown in jail for preaching the word of God and continued to do so? No, because the authority of Rome and the emperor is contingent upon God's authority. And if God was to if Paul was to overthrow God's authority to obey the emperor, then he would basically be contradicting the very basis of the emperor's own authority. So no, we have we do have an obligation to follow the emperor when and if he decrees something. We have to follow God first and foremost, and then whatever contradicts that, we do not have an obligation.
God tells us to make disciples, and preaching is clearly a big part of it. And I'm really hoping that at some point I can justify in my own mind that the fact churches have been stopped from meeting properly can justify me actually resisting some of what's going on. But I think this has been a difficult passage for me to think through, because I think it does mean, as Settler said in his video, Paul couldn't have been much clearer that we should be subject to the authorities, and the authority that he was talking about was one of the worst in history, that was eventually throwing Christians to the lions, and yet he said, be subject to it, up to the point when they tell you to do something truly immoral, at which point you should not do. Certainly, you should not do what the government tells you. If they, like the example of Stephen, he was right to continue to stick to his faith and proclaim Christ, even to the point of being stoned.
Right. And
yeah, I think on the matter of like obey the government except when they do what you say, unless they command you to do something immoral. I think where we see this similarly is with like what's brought up earlier, what you do with your parents. Where you generally have a duty of obedience to your parents, and like Romans 13, nothing in Romans 13 says don't obey them if they tell you to do something immoral.
Mhm.
But if someone told you like you should obey your parents, that doesn't mean that if your parents tell you to shoot someone, that you think that person means that you need to obey your parents in that. I think most people can conclude when you give someone an obligation of obedience that even if that is general, that's not absolute.
Exactly. By the way, I do want to say one thing with regard to the example of, church meetups when the government says don't. I think at a certain point, the government can tell the church not to meet up, such as, well, let's say the church is on fire and the fire marshal says, yeah, this is probably not a safe time for you guys to meet. I think it would be very stupid to say, well, we're not listening to you. We get a say in this. It's our church, but we're going right in. At that point, yeah, that's silly. However, I think
So you think the government should prevent people from going into their own building because it's preventing them from burning to death?
Hold on. I'm just using that as an obvious example.
Okay.
Right, because I don't think anyone would actually be so silly as to do that. My only point is the government does have a certain legitimacy in telling you when it is and is not dangerous. However, governments have also been so needlessly stupid and inconsistent and evil in their application of the bans about meetups that I actually would not. I could see, I don't want to get sued. I can see a case where it could be made that they've kind of lost their legitimacy to tell churches not to meet up when they say it's fine to meet in strip clubs.
I just want to be clear for YouTube and Anthony Fauci and the Canadian government that I fully endorse all lockdown regimens everywhere, no matter what.
Exactly.
The
That's
opinions
what we all believe
expressed
here.
by the guests of Settler do not represent the views of Settler's Lament channel.
And just to say, I'm not committing myself to this viewpoint. I can just see how somebody can make this case. Please don't sue me.
But yeah, I'd like to get to super chats. We have several. Chris W for $2 said nothing. So thank you for that. The KC40K for $5 said, thanks for introducing me to Moldbug. God bless. You're welcome. Glad to do that. Nicholas, I'm not going to try to pronounce the last name. Nicholas says, what's y'all take on AA Charlemagne's Weimar Republic stream and how terribly similar it is to the current state of the West? I haven't watched that stream, so I can't really say. Has anyone seen that stream?
No.
Okay. Yes, it was a good stream. But I guess in a nutshell, there are some similarities. We have there's a certain degree of cultural subversion going on. There's sort of economic and social political troubles, which are sort of analogous to the situation, but not exactly. I would say there are some differences. So. But yeah, I think it's a decent analogy.
Okay, yeah, like I said, I don't think the analogy is entirely unique. I've certainly heard it before, but I haven't watched the stream, so I can't really say the specifics of the points they make there. And then the same guy for another $5 says slavery is bad, frowny face, buys everything from Walmart.
Yes, perhaps slavery isn't as abolished as we thought.
Oh, come on. We all know that child slavery is great for the economy. Actually, no. Although, to be fair, I think Walter Block has argued for the benefit of has argued for the benefit of using sweatshops. But yeah, I'm not too familiar with the labor and economic viewpoint to say he's right or wrong about that one.
Yeah, child slavery might not be the best for the economy, but child labor, there's nothing wrong with that, right?
Yeah, we way over educate our young people.
Oh yeah. All I know is my grandma did just fine with this grade 6 education.
Well,
Yeah.
I mean, my goal for the trad restoration is for most of society to be illiterate. So, until we get there, I'm pretty black-pilled.
Can get behind that.
Viewers, stop teaching your kids how to read.
But yeah, so, I mean, do we have anything else to say? Is this it?
I'm good.
This might be a good time to stop. Done a couple of hours.
Yeah,
But,
well,
I guess I'll just shamelessly plug my stuff here at the end.
yeah. I was going to say, in preparation for the stream, I thought if I mention everyone to shill at the beginning of the stream, then more people will subscribe to your channels because like more people will hear it, and then completely forgot to do that. So sorry, remind me next time.
Okay. But yeah, so for those of you who don't know, I am Mr. Patriarch. I do all sorts of stuff. I do sort of meta-politics, culture, history, but two of the big things that I've done on my channel is 2 series. I did a multi-part series on fascism, where I went over a book, the Fascism, the Creator of a Concept, and right now I am going through Machiavelli's The Prince. So I am 5 subscribers away from breaking 900. I'm so close. Let's just get 5 more tonight, and then I can cure that OCD. So yeah, check out my channel, and we'll be going through The Prince together.
Should I go next? So you can go and subscribe to my channel, but actually what I want people to subscribe to is my Bible study channel, which...
That is the one I have linked.
Good, excellent. And if you go there, there is actually a stream with Nick Watts, who I mentioned. That stream is called Taxation is Slavery. And I put slavery in all caps because I'm trying to be as clickbaity as possible. But this video is not clickbait. It is worth anything. If you imagine how good this stream could be, it will live up to that and exceed those expectations. So go and check that out.
All right, my name is John Fisher 2.0. My channel is Original Win Productions, WIN Productions. I recently did a show with my Anglican friend, Father James, and it was basically Lent for evangelicals. So if you've ever had a tough time as a Catholic or someone who's Eastern Orthodox or anyone who really celebrates Lent in general and talking to your more evangelical friends, I would say it's a very good show to start off with. It actually has a great amount of detail in explaining Lent to them, how they might see it as suspicious, and how to address those concerns. The content is mostly Catholic-based. I come on here mostly for the political talk, which is nice. And if you're interested in supporting my channel, please feel free to donate to Patreon. And only do that if you've donated to Settlers First. I have to say that because I am a guest on his stream.
Yeah. Speaking of which, everyone remember to donate to Settlers Lament. But yeah, I mean that's it, I guess. So summary of the stream.
You just muted yourself.
The summary of the stream is all libertarian bad.
Possibly
every time.
There was a divine intervention because he was about to say something false.
If that was true, there would be nothing on my channel. I'm kidding.
Sorry. Yes, I'm back. Summary: all libertarians are going to hell. Yes. What else?
Will donations to Settlers Lament shorten your time in purgatory? Has there been a paper on that subject?
I can neither confirm nor deny. Okay. All I can say is it's possible that donations to Settlers
it might be
Lament
worth just putting a donation in just in case, right?
Yeah. I can't say they do count as indulgences. Just say it's a possibility. That's all I can say. But yes, one other thing, I don't know, leave comments about this, I guess. I mean, you should leave comments anyways. It helps with the stream. But one thing I'm thinking of doing is starting a second channel for like audiobooks of like stuff from the Church Fathers or other people. I did one of those. I read a homily of St. Augustine a while ago and it got horrible views. So I don't really want to do it more on this channel. But I was right before this, or not right before, but earlier today, I was doing a recording of the martyrdom of Polycarp. So that might be something I do. I might start a new channel for that. So if you think that sounds like a good idea, tell me to do it. But yeah, thanks everyone for watching. Goodbye.